Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get the show on the road. My name is Nick Axel. I'm a deputy editor of e-flux architecture. And we're very happy to welcome you all to this event tonight, which is celebrating the release of the new book by Srdjan Jovanovic-Weiss, Socialist Architecture, the Reappearing Act, which was published in 2017 by the Green Box. Thank you again all for coming. The way that tonight's event is going to be structured, Srdjan is joined by Nina Reappearing, and Srdjan will be giving a presentation about his research, and then the two will engage in dialogue with a series of questions, and then we will eventually open it up to the audience. So I will introduce the two speakers, and then we will get the show on the road. Srdjan Jovanovic-Weiss is a Yugoslav-born architect and theorist living in New York. He studied architecture at the University of Belgrade, Harvard University, and at Goldsmiths College, where he received his PhD on the architecture of balkanization. He's worked on projects and research with architects Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron and Richard Gluckman, and has collaborated on exhibitions with Lina Bobardi, Jona Friedman, and Anne Ting. His work has been shown at the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences in Belgrade, House of World Cultures in Berlin, and the Aronson Galleries at the New School in New York, among others. Jovanovic-Weiss, Srdjan is a contributing editor at Cabinet Magazine and a fellow of the group Forensic Architecture at Goldsmiths College. He's the author of Almost Architecture, published in 2007, Socialist Architecture, the Vanishing Act in 2011, and Socialist Architecture, the Reappearing Act, 2017. And he's also the founder of Normal Architecture Office, a consultancy for art, museums, and architecture based, I think, right across the street. Yeah. Nina Reappearing is an architecture critic, curator, educator, and publications director at the Yale School of Architecture. She founded and directs the think tank Vertical Urban Factory, which includes a traveling exhibition and a book published by Actar in 2016. Reappearing has taught urban theory and industrial urbanism at Parsons School of Design, Syracuse School of Architecture in New York, Barnard College, and Yale School of Architecture, and has contributed essays to many journals. With that, I will sit down and let Srdjan take us away with this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Nick, and thanks to e-flux for this opportunity. What we are trying to do here is to just look at the content of the project that was engaged for a couple of years now. This book that was shown is the second book in a row on the same topic. The first one was a photo book called The Vanishing Act, Socialist Architecture Vanishing Act. This one is the Reappearing Act. So there is a dialogue between the two. It is a collaboration with the photographer Armin Linke. Photography is much faster than writing. So in a way, that book came 5 years ago, and this one waited for a bit. But what I want to just kind of show a couple of things so that we can engage in discussion. Why socialist architecture? And is it socialist architecture or architecture in socialism? I always show this image at the very beginning. Of course, we know what this image is. It's a political map of the world produced by the United Nations, but there are no colors. It's all neutralized. And in a way, if you zoom in into the territory where I come from, it is actually shown by numbers. It's not shown by names of countries in order to neutralize the conflict. So I am from number 3. I have friends from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And I worked in all of these numbered countries. it's an interesting map. It's just the way how everything comes down to graphics, which also happens in socialism quite a lot. Now the main question is it architecture in socialism or socialist architecture? Why I'm asking this question is because, for example, there is a common belief, common understanding that there is nothing like, say, national socialist architecture, like Nazi architecture. It doesn't exist. It's basically neoclassical architecture. So they were all working under one style. But in socialism, it's not entirely clear because nobody can really, figure whether there were any crimes committed in socialism so clearly. One can assume, but whenever there are no crimes against humanity, then one can have something called Stalinist architecture or socialist architecture. So it's a blur. Now this diagram was produced by students at the Tyler School of Art. That actually, we were just having a question: is there something like socialist architecture in the world? And they're all in the same scale, right? They're kind of this kind of diagrammatic. The biggest one is 300-meter tall Tatlin's Tower, unbuilt. There is a Norman Foster on the top in Astana, in Kazakhstan, about 250 meters tall. There are others, the towers in Slovakia are all the way on the left, and they are so huge because they were built to transmit the signal from Radio Moscow to Europe. So if you're in Paris, you could listen. The clearest station would be Radio Moscow coming through these towers. The contribution of Yugoslavia, where I come from all these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is this much. So it's not a big contribution in a way, but it's very filling kind of, it's very kind of like a jewel-like, small one. And for a couple of years, Armin and I were just talking about it, and we knew that there are other people interested in the topic. There's a lot of interest right now. There are a couple of books. There is going to be an exhibition at MoMA next year. And so we were kind of traveling around and collecting these documents about these sort of more or less forgotten monuments. Now, in difference from, say, other books and other sort of interest in the socialist architecture, we were really interested in what the interiors are. What is the interior of, say, an ideological architecture? How is it tailored? How is it fit? So this is the first book that came out published, and this is, of course, this one. And I'm just going to show a couple of examples by what I mean being tailored to ideology. This building is Army headquarters, so it's built for the military from 1956 by an architect who was reading Henri Bergson. And I can guarantee that no generals understood what he was talking about. They just let him build it. It's a beautiful building. It's in disrepair right now. It was bombed by NATO, and now the current government in Serbia wants to take it down because they simply don't get it. And this building is from 1972. It's by a Slovenian office called Bureau 71. It's opera. It's a philharmonic, an opera in Skopje in Macedonia. It's a fantastic building. It kind of draws some. Yugoslavia was always in this kind of. It was not part of the East Bloc. In fact, it was always in this kind of identity search for some other architecture around the world that does not look like Stalinist or North American. So this is copying Finland and other parts of Scandinavia. What is really amazing is that these geometries have been done in 1971. So that's all pre-digital pretty kind of, very organic, and also done in a system which did not really have means to produce it. This is also the view of the outside, which is very amazing. We did, this photography, I mean, this woman just showed up. It's not a staged photograph. She showed up in white. Her date was late, and she was on the phone all the time, so Armin liked it a lot, and he photographed it. But what's actually, what I mean by what the socialist architecture really is that we always talk about the future, right? Like the socialism and communism is really always about the future. The future is future, so it's never today, it's always tomorrow. But this interior, which is unused today, was actually in complete brute concrete, and the authorities decided to paint it white. So you can see, I'm just going to show it right here. You can see that technology could paint it only up to certain levels. So you can imagine somebody with a stick painting white what was concrete. So it makes this incredible pattern. Second thing is that also there is also something about socialist architecture is that white concrete and red carpets and red curtains. This photograph is not from Yugoslavia. This is from exactly where this piano was playing from city of Birobidzhan in Far East Russia. But the feeling is very similar, is that this kind of drama of modernism and red carpet is matched. Back to Skopje and back to the opera house. What is also interesting about this place is that it was imagined to be 3 times bigger than it was built. But because there was not enough time to actually design all of this high-tech stuff, all of the seats that you see there, they are actually on the incline, like this. So you're like sitting in a, like a fast train, watching at some performance. And all of these things, especially this one, this is a house of the revolution, home of the revolution in a very small city in Montenegro. You can see it hasn't been finished, in fact. When 1989 came and the Berlin Wall fell, everything stopped. But you can see the immensity of the ambition. Another Slovenian architect, Marko Mušić, was doing it with a high-tech glass details and other kinds of things. Now, on the upper left, right, you can see that the economy of the new kiosks, in fact, that's the real economy. The rest is kind of a dream. So socialist architecture is kind of a dream, on and on. Good news about this building is that there are 2 architects, very good architects from Basel, HHF, and from Slovenia, that are actually doing a renovation of the whole space in a very smart way by renovating only 10% and leaving the rest as a park because it's too big. The same architect, Mušić, did other kinds of buildings like this one, also in a remote area in the mountains in Montenegro. In a way, the ingenious thing about this building is that it's also home of the revolution. The revolution passed, but it is also a municipality, so there are people there actually working every day. So it's alive. But when one look into the actually the color coding of the spaces, the blue is for the serious discussions about ideology and about various kinds of directions with all of these science fiction kinds of shapes. And of course the red and the yellow is for the bar where people meet and where kind of new relationships can actually happen. Now the same place is also becoming nature. This is a shot of one of the main spaces in the home of the revolution, where you clearly notice the ambition of structure, but also the encroaching of the nature within it. And we thought it was actually really interesting. There are other interesting objects like this one, an asterisk. It's a monument to a double commemoration of partisan struggle against the Nazis, but also Macedonian independence from Turkey. So it's done by a couple, artist and architecture couple, who were not allowed to, say, practice religion, but they were allowed to practice spirituality. So the whole thing is, in a way, designed in such a way that spirituality takes things first. They unfortunately passed away, but the engineer is alive, and I spoke to him, and basically he mostly was the most responsible for it. But there are also other places like massive parks. This one is in a city called Niš, and with this kind of resistance fists that were actually used quite a lot in Occupy Wall Street and in many of the demonstrations. They represent a man and a woman and a son. I'm not sure why there is no daughter there, but it's 1960s, so done by a Croatian artist. This is also another fantastic example called Petrova Gora, which was also, I think, done about 1 week before the Berlin Wall fell. And so it was open. It's actually open to visits. Today it is actually closed, but when we went there, you could go anywhere. It's beautiful design. It's a 12 stories tall building, in fact. And what you can see is titanium on the facade, which has been gradually skinned off by local residents and probably sold somewhere, or something was going on. But what is fascinating about this project is it is imagined by an artist. It's not imagined by an architect. Architect just comes in and kind of does technical sort of things and arranges for it to function and to stand. So the artist is allowed to destabilize things in socialism, but the architect is there to stabilize them. This is another shot from below. And also inside, when you go inside, you can see clearly, where the art happens and where the architecture happens. Anything curvy is art, anything straight is architecture, in a way, So we can simplify it like that. Of course, it may not be like that, but there is something about, socialist way of asking artists, in fact, to represent abstraction, and then having architects following it up. Now, why is that interesting? Why do we even talk about this? Because lots of the sources in Yugoslav architecture, come from the United States. And they come not by design, but they come by self-influencing, by looking to the other direction than Russia or any other place. This is especially amazing example of landscape architecture, which still there is no department of landscape architecture in Eastern Europe at all. But the architect Bogdan Bogdanovic, who was also influenced by United States, was designing this cemetery in Mostar, city of Mostar, and also was for the first time putting in figurative elements within the abstract modernist architecture of Yugoslav experience. You can see there is a kind of whole sequence of going up to a cemetery through a fictional village, because most of the warriors, most of the partisans, they come from villages, they come from the countryside, they didn't come from cities. So in a way, it is a kind of a memory to them. And And then they end up in this sort of summit, looking down to the city. The thing is that the cemetery does not really exist. I mean, there are no bones. There is no. It is just the idea of it. Is that in fact it can be. It is built with an idea that shows the identity of the struggle against fascism. Another story which also makes it very international, and I'm nearly to the end, is the Skopje, back to Skopje in Macedonia, went through a really massive earthquake in the 60s. And the authorities, with Tito, Josip Broz Tito at charge, staged a large solidarity campaign funded by the United Nations to actually find an architect to master plan the city. So this is the model by Kenzo Tange, celebrated Japanese architect. Two models by him. One is the original one at the top that we found. It was missing for 40 years. And then the one at the bottom is a model of one segment of the city built by local architects. It is actually an amazing story because this image that you see here at the bottom is kept exactly the way it was when the model was brought in. So the model became this kind of almost like a, how to say, something that is sacred, right? And all of even the kind of all these kind of cans around and the drawings are kept like a memorial. The only thing that disrupts the memorial is the happy 2009 year in the very middle. So unfortunately, the entire institute, this is the City Planning Institute, burned out early this year. And it's not known what actually happened to all of the artifacts. But then something about socialist architecture and today is the contemporary interpretation of it is that everyday life goes on, no matter what. So this is also Armin Lincoln's photograph of a tram going in front of the army headquarters, and people are pretty much unfazed by this whole experience. That's why I think it's very important to talk about it, especially internationally, because that also helps everybody there, not just us to understand what the experience really is. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion. One thing that I want to point out is, as though this new book is very small, it's filled with many, many deep ideas, and each idea could fill a chapter. So it's one of these very dense books with great information that is both architectural, sociological, and philosophical. So I hope it becomes a bigger project and book, and I know Srdjan has been working on that as well. And I'm particularly interested in the way he's created these kind of two dichotomies, one that of the first project of the Disappearing Act, and then this idea of the Reappearing Act. And I thought this idea of the Vanishing Act of the first book makes you question or wonder, how did it really disappear? And as you were saying, the work is so aspirational. When it wasn't complete, there's this odd moment of the buildings existing, but they're not finished. So in a way, they already had vanished. And I just wondered about this idea of vanishing and how that relates not just to the political shift, but also that of the architectural evidence.
It's a great question. because I'm really not trained as a historian, so I'm a kind of a fake historian
I don't
in
know,
this way.
but yes, okay.
But and I also work with an artist, with Armin Linke, and a lot of decisions that come through this process, like these examples I showed, they're really artist-architecture collaborations. I felt that we could not be correct. We don't have to be correct all the time. And for example, the Vanishing Act was, it came up, we were thinking of, when ideology constructs or is contingency for architecture, whatever ideology, when it vanishes, right, you still have architecture. I mean, you have spaces. And so that was the Vanishing Act, was kind of a word game to tell that what has vanished, in fact, reappears in unexpected ways. But this is something that I could do only with an artist, if you know what I mean. I couldn't have done it if I would go through some regular methodical art historian ways. So I hope this answers that question. And there is also a lot of how to say. I mean, one has to have a good hint to it. Like I of course thought of Houdini and his Vanishing Act, the Magician's Act. The magic of ideology is not just that it goes away, but it actually comes back, right, in its own form. So that was a word game.
So we were talking before about this idea that in modern architecture, so I'm very involved in Docomomo, the Modern Architecture Preservation Group, and one of the strangest things is to see modern architecture in ruin. And Bernard Schumi talked about this years ago, that to see crumbling concrete or new materials like glass shattered is a odd juxtaposition when we think that this work is new. And so I feel the same way with these works, and how that kind of ruin of modernism creates an aura that is unexpected. And that aura, though, for this kind of work, or even, let's say, the work of fascist architects like Giuseppe Turanghi in Italy, that work had one meaning, and then the meaning shifts with the new political system, but yet somehow the aura still remains. And I wondered if you could describe that aura of the socialism that still remains in the architecture, although it's been vacated. Yeah.
No, another good one. I mean, first of all, to explain this kind of socialism, we talk about something that I call soft socialism.
Yeah, and explain that too. That's
right.
great.
And meaning soft, meaning liberal, meaning much more open, not as, say, Soviet kind of socialism, or Albanian or Romanian or Bulgarian. It's sort of kind of a market-driven socialism. There is even a word for that, which I learned in my primary school, called dialectical materialism, meaning that we are all pragmatic, in fact. We believe in communism, but we are actually pragmatic, right? That's how we were all told to be. So there is that kind of liberal opening to ideology, which was practiced. I mean, it's dead now. So, and it had a very short span of about 50-something years. And, but it's an interesting one because it played itself as an exception to the rule of communist countries. And the architecture and art, by far, was one of these places where this would be expressed. Right? The second thing in soft socialism, I mean, is that a lot of things are allowed to do, which you would do, say, in the West. Take the example of Marina Abramović, for example. I mean, most of the time, Marina would try to break the system because it was so soft that she had to be so radical and do things which would break that softness. So there is something about hardness of architecture which needs to happen, which kind of solidifies that tailoring to liberal common life. Now, if now that thing is that when you talk about the ruins, and I love it, we get. I mean, we're not. I'm not the only one working on this topic, and but we get a lot of comments. First of all, that photography is too aestheticized, and so I get a lot of criticism saying, why is it so aesthetic? I say, why not? And second is that the discussion about what actually drives the aesthetics is not simply in the photography, it is in the architecture itself. And that's why it is not nostalgic. That's what I want to say.
Right. Well, that's interesting too. This issue that, right, the beautiful ruin. When we think of even Detroit and the photography of Detroit and the photography of all these ruined monuments, but I think here what's interesting is this kind of aura that remains in the building. That is because it had a meaning. It was built for a purpose, and it was built for a political system. So how is that then, what reappears today? What is reappearing now in the architecture? Is it just the physical buildings that are being reused, or is there something also ideological that's reappearing?
Well, in my opinion, the thing is, what is actually super interesting about these places is that they're more public than they were ever intended now. So if anybody goes there, you can actually walk around and not be interrupted. Kids are playing soccer inside these buildings. And there is something about it that actually makes it, they were designed for functionaries, for people in position. They would kind of have a badge, a ticket. But now you can just go there, and in a way they act like a cave, like nature. So there is something about that is very liberal as well. And if you compare it to Detroit, in a way, similar things may happen in that sense. But I'm not going to go there, because it's kind of a different, dangerous comparison.
It would be interesting to know, though, too, like, who is it that's using these buildings? And if it were also the those who had been in power, or those people who believed in these ideals, are they nostalgic for the past when they enter the buildings, when they see them again? And is there kind of an interest in a restoration plan for them?
No, I don't think so. I mean, most of them are for sale, in fact. So if anybody has 2.5 million euros, you can buy that amazing monument. But it's not, in a way. But nobody does it because after findings that we had through this process, they're so tailored so much to representation of common living, is that, say, you can't make a hotel out of it, right? You cannot make some restaurant, not yet. So the tailoring of architecture was so tight, and still is tight, is that they are resilient, to use the word resilient, to the capitalist change. Now, we don't know what is going to happen, of course, in the future, because one, generally people really hate those buildings. They're not loved, right? For various reasons. One reason is that they are abstracted, and that's where the American influence comes in. They're abstracted, and the abstraction doesn't really communicate as figuration, right? So you can see, all of these socialist buildings, that there are no stars, there are no tanks on top of buildings, there are no statues. There is nothing that you think that is socialist, right? They are totally abstracted. And they were not really explained to a lot of people today that simply think they are an aberration of history of architecture, right? So there is that component to the whole story.
And
which can
when-
relate back.
And when you think about this idea of even a style of architecture or being emptied of its kind of self, of its soul, yeah, back to that question of can these be adapted for new uses? Because they were so specific to both in function and form, much more so than many modernist building or many buildings of the time. And as you said, they were actually really looking to the Finnish organic architecture, more alto in a way. But how does that then restrict them so that they can't be reused? Just their formal qualities.
Good question. I mean, the one I mentioned that is actually going under the renovation, the Home of the Revolution in Montenegro, done by HHF architects of Basel and Sadar Vuga from Ljubljana, is a super interesting project because we had a conference on that, is that how to treat such a massive, hybrid, of structure today. The architect is alive still today, and he's a pretty tough guy, so they, the whole thing to do it basically is let's call it progressive, okay? Is that everything is percentages. So like 10% say you renovate perfect the way it can be, 40% is kind of informal, and then the last 50% is just left to the nature, right? Because the buildings are so well designed at the time, is that they are safe, right? You just need to repair a little bit, right? And I think that is coming somehow to minds of politicians as well and other folk.
Should I do one more question? So back to this question of the ideology that a building embodies. I mean, could we be seeing that today with our current president? What happens when a state disappears, but the buildings remain? And I think it's maybe a broader issue. It'd be interesting to hear you relate it maybe to another place. You were just in Russia for a project. But can these buildings remain, or should they be destroyed by the next generation if they don't believe in the politics?
Oh, I don't think they should be destroyed.
I mean,
that's in a way. In Russia, I was in Far East. I showed this photograph of Philharmony. This is an amazing architecture. Nobody knows about it, but simple immensity of this endeavor, to actually have a center for culture is very socialist in that sense. Now, when you ask me this question, with today's political situation, does that pass away? I don't think so. I think that the reappearing act of socialism is simply people want to live together and they want to work together. There is nothing wrong about it. It's just something quite beautiful, and people want to help each other, and then create a space for that. I think that is the reappearing act of socialist architecture.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind asking one question, maybe if you don't mind, before we open it up for discussion. But it's to follow up on this last question of kind of what happens, or what to do with the architecture after the regime ends. I would almost like to pose the opposite question: what do you do with the architects? So I'm kind of wondering, so you said that the architects, and I'm not saying like do you get rid of the architects, but what I'm wondering is, there's a particular culture of there's a vigor that was cultivated under socialism within the architectural community of Yugoslavia, and so what I'm wondering is, when socialism disappeared, was that aesthetic culture, or that exuberance translated? Was it able to manifest itself in other forms?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, again, I'll just repeat. Yugoslavia is really a mirror of the United States in very many ways, and the New World, not just United States, Mexico, Brazil. You know, the authorities had to somehow find a way how to dissociate from the Eastern Europe and from Russia. But with architects, I'll tell you an anecdote. You know, when we published the first book, The Vanishing Act, Socialist Architecture, I got a couple of very angry emails by architects saying there is no socialist architecture, there's only architecture in socialism, right? And we had this debate. Now we are best friends, you know, it's always like that. So we had these debates that, exactly that, you know, with the architects who are alive, right? I mean, they have clues to how they were working. Now, the one thing that is very interesting about, say, socialist architecture in Yugoslavia is that there were very, very few personal offices of architecture. Meaning, like, it's not like in the Western system where you have you start out of a kitchen, you expand, blah, blah, blah. No, this was all part of larger state companies which treated architects as artists, right? So in a way, they did not do, very few did detailing, for example, that Nina would understand very much, like in the West. So the system simply was different, and they know it, and they knew, the architects, they knew that they were a special part of society that were selected to actually design for it, right? And so there was some kind of prestige to it, and they still feel it, right? The ones that are still alive.
Okay. Cool. So maybe I'll not follow up, and I'll let Brian.
Thanks so much for this, Serjan. I just managed to combine my two questions into one, which is, I wonder if you could say a bit more about this influence from the New World and the distance of Yugoslavia to Eastern Europe and to Russia. You mentioned that many of these architects were more related to U.S. Modernism rather than kind of generic vanilla modernism, and also the influence of kind of soft liberalism, right? I wonder if you could say a bit more about the New World.
Yeah, I mean, I can unpack it a little bit. You know, the entire, it's a 50 years of socialist Yugoslavia, right? And at the very beginning, 1948, Yugoslavia breaks away from the Soviet Union and has to figure something as identity, and they switch to an American model. The Central Committee in Belgrade was built to look like a tower on Park Avenue, meaning they meant business, if you want to be. But then, like slowly as the thing progressed, especially Slovenian architects were very, very tough about switching towards the Scandinavian source, organic source, mountains and things like that. But there was also one of the things that what we were showing here is mostly late socialism. So it's a kind of when it was already going downwards. Josip Broz Tito was already getting old age, and he was commissioning most of these buildings to kind of keep some heritage for him. But what is interesting is that when the system goes down, and he was asking that system goes down, somehow architecture gets commissioned more. So they had actually a lot of work. They built quite a lot. And actually, I mean, the Skopje example, it's built 3 times more than it's needed. And at 1/3 of the rate that was built. So there is some kind of irrational connection between when the system falls down and when the architects come in. Yeah.
Hold on, can we just switch the mics really quick?
I had a related question in sort of provoked by your question about the Trumpian moment. As you may know, I called for architects to stop working as a protest. This, I guess my question is, what should a socialist architect do during the Trumpian times?
It's just impossible. I mean, I don't know. I can just give an example. I mean, again, going back to Skopje, architects, when architects don't have work, they're usually at the front line of demonstrations and demonstrating. And I was one of them. And I studied architecture during the war. So when cities were destroyed, we were being taught how to build them. It was totally ridiculous, in a way, right? And then, so in a way, and it's happening today also. I mean, in Macedonia, in Skopje, you have amazing groups. There is this group called the First Architectural Brigade that really goes demonstrating in front of the newly kitsch built architecture, in front of that revolutionary one. And they're very conscious of it, and they know. I think Nicola is still here. I don't know if he is. So there are amazing groups, because architects really don't have work. Very similar situations in Italy. Yugoslavia is not that different, because it's an overproduction of students, overproduction of architects, and there is not that much opportunity. But what is interesting, what you're asking, is in the situation is that this is exactly the constituency that are going to go first to the streets, and they're going to organize themselves, and they are designers. They can make graphic, they talk to each other. They're not artists. They're kind of, their mind is like an architect collective. So that's happening. I mean, take a look at Russia now with all of their protests, and also go through other places. Most of them are architectural students because they don't have anything else to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Srdjan. I wanted to come back to the dialectics between the two titles of your two publications, The Vanishing Act and The Reappearing Act. And it's a question that Nina asked in the very beginning, because I do think, there's a pretty radical discursive shift happening, obviously, and I haven't quite figured out what the shift is. And especially, I haven't figured it out because I think your presentation was mainly based on the Vanishing Act. It was the buildings in the ruinous states that we saw. It's a very clear argument that you're making there. But it left me with the question, so where actually is then the Reappearing Act, and in what ways or in what other architecture is it based, if not that? Are you rereading the same ruinous architectures in a new way, as a proto-utopian gesture that could become resurgent, or are you actually talking about a completely different architecture?
It's a good question. I mean, it's you can take this, as I said, as an art project. If it is an art project, it destabilizes the method of architectural history. And so in that sense, things are freer, right? We could pick that title like that. But I think your comment that what is the Reappearing Act is what I thought and what I discussed with Armin Linke is that it's the future. It's the continuous idea that there is future, which is not today. So the reappearing does not happen like pop-up. It's not a pop-up store. It's not that. It's basically something which is, as an idea, that happens sometimes, right? We work towards that. That's why the Reappearing Act came in as such, and that's why I could show the Vanishing Act examples as that. So in a way, I know it's a little bit confusing, but we just thought that no one has done it that way, all right?
But also, you already said, too, that the Reappearing Act is really the reappropriation of these buildings without the socialism as a political ideology attached to them. So in a way now, they're empty vessels ready for the public to take on again. I mean, you could say the same thing with Turangi. I mean, I remember studying Giuseppe Turangi. People would always say, oh, that's fascist architecture, or the EUR in Rome, it's fascist architecture. No, it was, or the architects were fascist, right? But we would always say, maybe, but the buildings were built by the fascist regime, and now they can be used for other things. So I think that's the Reappearing Act. It's the art project of the contrast between the two, but the fact that these buildings now can be made available to be reused. Even if they're so specific to some of their uses, it's almost like, okay, now's the time to do this, and let's see what the people will do with it, in a way.
But I think that there is something that you're saying within this too, is that there is, that ideology can be embedded within architecture. That the dream of socialism can be read in the curvature of the glass. And so I think that it's maybe a bit of a ghost. It's like, something is reappearing, but we don't really know, is it neoliberal, is it socialist, is it just, survivalist, or, what is going on? But from a very kind of basic way, this, going from vanishing to reappearing, or, it's a rather like pessimistic view to a rather optimistic view. That something is there, that something is quite potential. But I don't know. I think it's. I know, like the case with fascist architecture is a much more kind of like heavily trodden path within architectural history. But I think that this question or this comment that you put at the beginning, because there is no, there is no explicit crime that was done by socialism. It's like we just don't know what to really think about it. But I think that,
Yeah. So that's why I would say these buildings don't have the ghost of socialism, but the spirit. It's like a ghost also is more pessimistic, meaner, but these have a spirit or an aura that will kind of make them reappear, something like that.
Well, that's beautiful.
About this issue of rehabilitation that you bring up, and you talked about. It's okay.
but for the live stream.
Recording. Can you talk about the preservation ethos, which, in effect, we've talked about the capacity that these could be rehabilitated, but what is here in America, like we have the statue, and this goes to the monuments question that's come up. Here, we have a statue in front of the Plaza Hotel that was rehabilitated all gold and changed it, and it was kind of an ethos of nostalgia or some other things that we might not find as appealing. But I was just curious if you could characterize the ethos of preservation or rehabilitation in Serbia.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I mean, I would allow myself to be cynical about that, is that I believe that there is a future of neglect, that neglect has a future when something is neglected. I mean, it has, since the ancient times. We have, sites which were just left, fixed like that, from Rome until today. So there is something about it which is totally non-nostalgic. It's just a pragmatic decision. And the second point, I think, to come back to this, when So ideology vanishes, or when the symbolism vanishes, something else really reappears. You know, things that happen in these places are totally non-planned. I mentioned, you know, when we went to Tito's village, the Kumbrovec, you know, kids are playing soccer inside, and you know, they hang out. So that's totally unplanned, and that is the reappearing act of socialism, because it's free. You know, it's open up. And I think that this, I think the new architects I think there is a new movement understanding the potential of such spaces which were oversized. You know, most of these buildings are oversized. That they did not have to have to be that big, right? So, so now, you know, the new approach for preservation is not what to be preserved, but on the, you know, scale of 1 to 10, what can be at the scale of 10 and what can be at the scale of 2. So what can be neglected? I think that's super clever, new way of approach, and I think I mean, Swiss architects are doing a really great job about that, and Slovenians, and I think Americans as well. But to come back to this issue of the monument, many of these. Okay, my work really was not focusing on monuments. It was focusing on institutions and the interior of institutions. I mean, like, you know, like a suit, right? Because institution is designed is tailored, like a suit that, you know, somebody is being presented as such. And so in that way, the preservation is perhaps an interesting topic to ponder and discuss. Because nobody really knows what to preserve, right? What you know, we preserve a detail or material or shape, or so that I think that's the future that will be coming up in discussion.
Future of neglect is a fascinating concept, but also as a spatial paradigm. So I wrote down something you said where as cities are being destroyed, architects are being taught how to build them, right? Which is also like a kind of riddle, because it's as absurd as it is absolutely pragmatic, right? So I wonder how a future of neglect might relate to this kind of logical illogic.
Okay. I think today, I mean, I don't know, my sense is that today architecture has, you know, we went through like various revolutions in the last 20 years. You know, the critical revolution of the 90s, then the digital revolution, now the new sort of simplicity coming up, new normality coming up. It's all going very fast. So the future of neglect, say, in cities is one of the, I would say, intellectual decisions that are not just done by architects, but it can be spearheaded by architects and artists, you know, simply neglect something. You know, there is an intellectual movement in neglect. So I don't know if this answers your question, but you know, this whole thing, what I want to point out is that usually when a situation is like this, the artists are coming in doing architecture. And that is super interesting. It is for architects very intimidating because artists have a completely more direct, how to say, sense of what to move where, right? Architects always have to have some system and something, some tools, and then it will come out. But you know, Sarah is here. I mean, Sarah works with architecture. I mean, like when I see, you know, work like this or by others, you know, like I think like, why don't we, you know, why weren't we educated like that? You know, like So in that sense, the neglect is not simply keeping things, apart. They're kept, right? They're just kept in neglect. And that's the future of it. And I think this is super intellectual future. And it is actually, an exit to many crises that are happening around the world. I mean, I was not the only, I just want to make this point. There are architects in Syria, there are architects in Egypt, there are, all over the place that are educated positively, that continuously positively or even optimistically, not to mention India, kind of build cities for some reason. But there is a movement which is noticeable that actually the building is not the only solution, right? One can be a theorist, one can understand it, one can read the city, one can scan the city, make data, all of that you can do today. So in that sense, the future of neglect may sound like the vanishing act, negative, right? But in a way, it has the future in it.
Actually, I have a comment, but I'm going to ask you for your opinion on my comment. And I think I've been thinking about this question of preservation. And I would say that many of these monuments that we're talking about are not necessarily only affected by passive neglect. They're also victimized actively through vandalism. And I think it's important to understand that, in my opinion, many of these monuments, even though, maybe that goes against your thesis of the vanishing act, they continue to have this symbolic meaning of signifying a previous political system that they were built to sort of build a federal identity, which was against the nation states out of which federal Yugoslavia was made up. And most of the countries that we're talking about in the present are run or have been run until recently by super ultra-nationalist governments who have absolutely no interest in this idea of a pan-Yugoslav notion of and so I visited the Mostar Cemetery, which is indeed an unbelievably stunning monument. It's a landscape park, and you can just assume that under socialism, families would go there and spend their weekends there because it's really wonderful. And at the same time, they get sort of, in a soft way, infused with the notion of a federal socialist republic in which many cultures, religions, languages house under one roof in peace. But this monument was restored completely after the war. It's in Mostar, Bosnia. It was paid for by, I think, Dutch funds. And the thing is back to ruins because mainly, I guess, Croatian nationalists vandalize it, which is not surprising. So I think actually the architecture may have vanished or may be in the process of vanishing, but it's not just, I think, a passive or, situation, but it's one that is actually actively produced in a war of ideology, I guess.
Good point. I always, to this kind of question, this architecture was made to be international, in my opinion. It's made to, if you want American expression, it's made to show off to the West. And that's why the higher technology was involved. There was a lot of, Museum of Modern Art was being advising how to build museums in Yugoslavia, so there was the whole, orchestration of it, to become international. And this is why it is so interesting now, is that the reading will most likely be more international than national. I mean, that's what I think saves those examples, because precisely international from all sides, from anywhere. I mean, take Yugoslavia was part of, and it still is, observer of the non-aligned movement of countries, the global South, which today is much bigger than it was. I mean, I was just in India just a few months ago, and it's still alive, like they talk about it, right? And by saying that this internationalism is something that I believe keeps preservation at its bay, meaning keeps it, has the ideology of preservation is international. I'm not meaning international style, aka Philip Johnson and all that stuff, but simply international, being beyond one country and being beyond the Cold War, in that sense. Just talking to each other. I think it's a great question, and again, what I'm happy for, I'll tell you something why I work with Armin Linke. Okay, this is an anecdote, but I think it's a funny one. We met at some art show somewhere, I don't know where, I think in Basel, and we were just talking about it. And then I saw his work, and he couldn't tell me where the photos were taken. He just wouldn't remember. So that's how he worked, right? He would take a photo somewhere, and then he would kept asking me, where was I? And I thought that was brilliant, because it wasn't an historical photo where you have to be correct and you have to capture every aspect of it. There are photographers who do it really, really well, but he just doesn't. He totally doesn't remember where he was. And for me, that was a fascinating thing to make it international, because it's not a touristic photography, obviously. And the second anecdote is that, his camera, he has two cameras, and they're 120 years old. So I tell him, look, they're older than socialism, right? So you can actually capture the dust, in a way. So there are many, why I'm saying this is that there are so many things in the method which were kind of like, the rules were broken in many ways, right? And in that sense, the preservation is also something that may be living rather than, making things dead. I mean, there are many examples where, there's this other example, it's not in our book, where, people are really fighting about whether it's this called the Old Fairground in Belgrade, which was it's the only constructivist, kind of built in Yugoslavia and in the New Belgrade, and with this tower. But then it was basically built by Germans and Italians and Czech and Romanians, basically the entire Nazi sort of crowd from 1933. And then it becomes a death camp in 41. And then the Allies, mistakenly bombed it in 1945. So now, what do you do now, right? Rebuild it? For what reason? Not rebuild it, for what reason? And the answer is, people who are there now, right? There are about 3,000 people living in that compound. And the former government, which unfortunately was democratic, was not nationalist, wanted to move them out. And so we had meetings there saying, well, if you want to commemorate, say, Holocaust or something like that, by moving people out, that is not really correct thing to do. You don't kind of evict people out. So there are a lot of issues like this happening, at least to what I know and what my colleagues and friends know, also from the socialist heritage, is that some of them are used. And the right-wing governments want to stop that use. They want to seal them off. I mean, the Petrov Agora is now sealed. You can't go there now. It was open a year ago, and now it's completely sealed. So that's a danger that is actually happening. That's why I think these informal activities are really super interesting, you know, because that's the constituency. These are the people who are used, the kids in that, you know, Tito's political school, they are the custodians of memory. They may not know what they protect, but they are the custodians, you know, they're there, and I like that a lot.
Yeah. This might be the last question. So I'm a bit conflicted with you know that this question might be kind of quite dumb or kind of antithetical to what you're saying, but I want to preface it. You know, the word nostalgia has been talked about a lot, and I almost wonder, like, when you see these structures, the question like comes into your mind, like, well, why aren't people nostalgic? Why don't you like be really nostalgic about this and actually try and bring socialism back in these structures? You know, so like, why aren't there LARPs, or why aren't there like like weird reenactment communities? But I mean, so okay, that's just like the anecdotal, you know, start, because you know, in other parts of the world, particularly in Moscow, which I understand is a very different context, but you have the preservation and the rehabilitation of sites like this for arguably fascist ends. You know, you have the Vandaka, you have the restoration of Stalinist monuments, and so I wonder, you know, is there not like some sort of, you know, threat, or, you know, in the sense a ghost, not necessarily a spirit, of these things being re-utilized towards ideological ends or re-weaponized by a political system of governance?
It's a good question. I mean, what I can respond is that most of the people really do not understand these buildings. They're actually even, whoever is doing research on it, there were even special editions in local magazines explaining, say, what this army headquarters was. Why is it like that? You know, they were literally telling, like, you know, like what it is. So in a way, the regular folk would not be attached to it. It was kind of up in the sky in many, many ways, and it was an elite. These are elite constructions, right? They're you know, people are being presented with them as something like, you know, like a ballet or like elite music or something like that. So in that sense, nostalgia is a tough one to ponder, like it would be, say, the Russian nostalgia, when you have a lot of work nostalgia in Yugoslavia, because simply there's just misunderstanding. You know, people are not attached to them. I mean, the Army headquarters is half down already, you know, because they have to repair it. I mean, it's just a lot of these stories, right? But nostalgia is a good one. I mean, I don't know. I would say in a soft ideological system, such Yugoslavia was, the kind of nostalgia was somehow bypassed. Like, it's not that you are longing for sometimes, you know, it was kind of very skillfully bypassed. And the main person who wrote about this was not Tito, was another Slovenian, Edvard Kardelj. He was the main ideologue of the entire system. He was a second high school teacher from some village in Slovenia. But he masterfully managed, you know, to kind of make this, which I explain in the book. It's called a key rotational system, which is how to give commissions to different nations, different states within a multinational country, right? And they really idealistic. They really believed, you know, that this system is going to basically reduce the state down. It's called de-etatization. There is even a word for that. So, so in that sense, nostalgia did not get, there was no door for nostalgia. Nor there is one today, right? Like, say, you have in Eastern Europe, other places. But it's a fascinating phenomenon, and that we can look at Yugoslavia as the future in that sense, not as the past, in many ways.
Well, with that.